Good morning and welcome to this first panel discussion of the day. I think it might be unlike anything you've ever seen. You know, the journalist motto is first simplify, then exaggerate. And I just did that, but only a little. Our topic this morning is as old as humanity itself. Us versus them. Now, the us, for many of us in the room, has always been the West and Western liberal democracy. But none of our speakers this morning are Western. None grew up in a liberal democracy. We have China, Russia, and the Middle East, aka Gotham City, represented on this panel. The West, ladies and gentlemen, has been relegated to the humble role of moderator this morning. Now, I hope it's too early to write the obituary for Western democracy. It sort of makes me think of Mark Twain, who read his own obituary in the newspaper and remarked, "The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." But if liberal democracy were to retreat further, we would all know what story to write. And then it would be less Mark Twain, and it would be more Spike Milligan, the late Irish comedian, on whose gravestone it said, "I told you I was ill." Western democracy is ill. And I'm going to start with you, Nathan, this morning. You and your fellow protesters in Hong Kong are fighting for the rights of democratic freedoms, while in the West we're struggling with our own democracies. What is the us and the them for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the forum. I think speaking on the story of Hong Kong is really important in this time, especially that we are fighting for democracy and autonomy of our hometown. And talking about we and them, I think the minimal understanding is in a certain national state, we need boundary that we determine who can enjoy the service and who can vote. But in a sense that it is being manipulated by authoritarianism is another story. Because according to what has been doing from the China side, I can tell that from my personal story, the worst form of this kind of we and them or identifying people unlike you is to stir hatred among people, is to use misinformation campaign to create conflict among people, and that's what China has been doing. Like for example, I take myself as an example. In August, I departed from Hong Kong to the US to embark my further studies in Yale University. And back then, China's Daily and the CCTV put me on their website in Weibo, which is the largest social media in China, which they have millions of followers. And accusing me as CIA agent because of my study in Yale, accusing me because of all the so-called violent conflict in Hong Kong, and saying that I am receiving foreign sponsorships to ignite the protest in Hong Kong, and it's all misinformation and stigmatization to the protest. But what it resulted is I received a lot of death threats on the social media, and I reported to the local authority in the US, and it was all in the news. So you could see that by having this misinformation campaign, stirring hatred among people, they put you in a dangerous spot, and most importantly, they use the nationalism in China, which has always been one of the most powerful weapons for the Chinese Communist regime, to go against a protest that is fighting for democracy and autonomy. And you can see from the 5 demands that the protesters have been insisting that none of them is about fighting for independence. None of them is fighting for separatism of Hong Kong. But China, by framing in that way, they undermine the legitimate demand of Hong Kong people fighting for democracy, which China has promised them in 1980s. And it was all written black and white in international treaty, which means that China is circumventing their obligation and their responsibility that they are entitled to fulfill because of the international treaty they signed with the British government in 1980s by stigmatizing the movement with so-called separatism, or even they are saying that we are having a terrorist in Hong Kong. And that is the worst form of we and them politics. That's the worst form of identity politics that China has been manipulating.
So China is basically framing this as the Hong Kong protesters against the Chinese people. But you are saying, no, it's the Hong Kong protesters, the pro-democracy movement, against the Chinese regime.
Well, we made it really, really clear that Chinese Communist Party, who has been ruling China with authoritarian ruling, is the only thing that we're going against. For the Chinese people, we all understand that they are living in such a closed nation that they cannot receive even just and fair information. People in China, if they don't have access to VPN, if they don't have access to foreign information, they cannot know the truth of what's happening in Hong Kong, because all the internet firewall blocked information and they create their own reality by the Communist Party, which they frame Hong Kong protests as a terrorism. And how absurd is it for any of the audience who has been following Hong Kong news and clearly understand the demand and the pursuit of Hong Kong people?
Now, there have been some reports that people who speak Mandarin or people from mainland China who found themselves inside these protests, either reporting, for example, there's a case of an American, Chinese reporter for The New Yorker who didn't feel very welcome by the protesters. So seems to be this distrust now on both sides. In that way, is China's disinformation campaign actually winning ground to a certain extent? Is this narrative sinking in even on the Hong Kong side?
Well, I think for most of the protesters, we're not going to judge a person by his appearance, by his ethnicity, by what language he or she is speaking, but by their attitude towards freedom, towards our pursuit, and by the attitude of them, whether they fully embrace the so-called misinformation campaign and all these authoritarianism values that are imported by China. So, well, if you look at the attitude of us towards the videos of some mainland speakers speaking up for Hong Kong, which, well, by merely holding a sign in China supporting Hong Kong, they could be locked in jail for years. We appreciate them, we admire them, and I think we should be standing in solidarity with the people in mainland and in the world who are aware of the authoritarian ruling. We stand in solidarity, and that is crystal clear. That is our stance.
I think it's very interesting that the Chinese government is framing this in this way and called you a CIA spy, a traitor, and so on. It sort of shows to what extent we find ourselves in this proxy standoff between China and the United States, between China and the West. In some ways people talk about a new Cold War. I'm not sure it quite does it justice. But Nathan, where do you see this going? Because, if you take that analogy, I mean, in 1989, the Soviet Union was on its knees. It was in decline, it was economically bust, and democracy prevailed. China is stronger than ever. It's rising. It's got the strongest president since Mao Zedong. Where is this going?
Well, when we're talking about the revival of authoritarianism and the shrinking of democracy, we have to be aware that somehow we, or the Western world, has been ruling that for the past decades, because they blindly believe that China will open up automatically by having its economic freedom. But, well, if you observe the situation since Xi Jinping came in power, the civic society in China basically collapsed because of the suppression of the government. They have no signs of opening up their politics. And we have to be aware that, and for now, the world has to act in order to protect our freedom and say that authoritarianism is not an alternative. People living under the suppression of the Communist Party and the authoritarian ruling, they have no dignity. We should be standing up for our system and for the liberal values that we are all enjoy. And I think, for the world, we need to understand that, and there are several things that we could do to follow that up. But I will explain it.
We'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Let me go to Kassem. I almost didn't recognize you. What's with the mask?
I really think it's funny that politicians get to ban masks while they get to wear them almost every day and just wear a poker face and go out on TV and lie to people every day, and without anybody telling them you should take your mask off. It's really funny that the Chinese government has activated a law from 100 years ago, from 1922, to ban protesters in Hong Kong from wearing gas masks that can actually save their lives. In 2013, August 2013, I was gassed with sarin gas, and if we had gas masks, hundreds, maybe thousands of people would have had their lives. We could have saved a lot of lives if we only had gas masks. And now they just want to ban it when they get to wear it every day. Greedy CEOs, lying politicians, hypocrite journalists who go out and talk about things that they actually have no clue about. They get to wear their masks, but we don't.
So, Kassem, we want to hear more about your story. In 2011, you were kind of doing what Nathan is doing now. You were fighting for democracy, standing up for democracy in your own country, in Syria. And you got beaten down. You made the same appeals to the West to help that Nathan is just making here now. And nobody helped. Maybe just give us a quick overview of your story.
Well, I was born not far away from here. You know, we Syrians and the Greek people, we share a lot of history, we share a lot of food. While other nations measure time with days and months, we measure time with civilizations and empires. We've been here for thousands and thousands of years. Damascus is the oldest capital in history. We're not barbarians. We didn't just decide one day that we would just want to kill everyone and then go to Europe and invade Europe. In 2011, we had an uprising. A lot of people, self-included, we've been living for tyranny for more than 40 years, 4 decades by the same dictatorship. Our only window, my only window to the world was actually reading Reader's Digest magazine and comic books. That was actually forbidden. Anything was forbidden. Anything that will show you another image beyond the Iron Curtain of the Assad dictatorship, which is a horrible mix of fascism and communism combined together. I grew up with poverty in a very dark place where dreams are crushed and we have no opinion. Everyone was telling us since we were born that the walls have ears, that we cannot talk, we cannot think, we cannot love, we cannot have any kinds of dreams. My only dream, and everyone's dream, was actually to leave Syria, to get away from this big prison without walls. But in 2011, our dreams changed. During the Arab Spring, instead of all thinking about how we should leave the Middle East, how we should leave the Arab world and run to Europe or run to America, we actually just wanted to stay home and make our countries a better place for everyone. We stood up in the streets and we started chanting for freedom, for democracy. We were asking for the West to stick for his high principles of human rights and the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we discovered that it was all bullshit. Democracy is, I think it's not for everyone. At least this is how the world is going right now. We were standing in the streets the same way people in Hong Kong are standing now and chanting for freedom and democracy. We've been also called terrorists.
And at that time it was President Obama in the White House.
Yes, President Obama, my biggest disappointment in life. He's a man of color, the first US president to actually be a man of color, someone different, someone who will feel like the 95% of this population on earth feels, the people who doesn't live under democracy. We thought that this man is gonna help us, but he just betrayed us. He sold Syria, he sold the entire Middle East to Iran to get the Iran deal done. He did a lot of horrible things that he was just too good at talking and like getting people to their knees with his beautiful words. In 2011, like I said, we marched for freedom. Our government responded with violence. They called us terrorists, they called us CIA agents, the same way Nathan and others were called. Dictators around the world, they have a manual, I call it. It's a dictatorship manual. And we were asking for the West to protect us. They didn't. I lived for more than 2 years under siege and bombardment by my own government when I watched dozens and dozens of children starve to death, getting bombed every single day, women getting raped, mosques getting bombed and destroyed, schools, hospitals, all the infrastructure the regime destroyed to make our lives miserable. We had to leave and flee because of that. But I decided to stay and defend my country. I worked as an activist. I launched a hunger strike for more than 30 days to actually try to get the people around the world to understand that the regime is using an old Russian tactic, which is starvation and siege until surrender. And I got thousands of people to join me, including Congressman Keith Allison or Noam Chomsky, a lot of people from around the world. But it wasn't enough.
And you know, just to sort of butt in here, this back to the sort of issue of us versus them. You fought on the side of democracy, but democracy let you down. And then you fled your country because you had to in the end, after surviving barely a sarin gas attack. You came to Germany, a liberal democracy where you now have refugee status. And it was us versus them all over again.
Well, we all had to leave in Syria because of dictatorship. We didn't leave because of an earthquake. We didn't leave because we decided that we just want to spend the summer vacation in Europe or in Sweden or somewhere here in Greece. We had a dictator. He kept dropping bombs on us, barrel bombs, chemical weapons. In August 21st, 2013, I was literally gassed to death with thousands of people using sarin gas. I just woke up and I couldn't breathe. My chest was on fire. All the neighbors were running, falling on the ground, suffocating. Everyone was, I don't know, watching a scene of the apocalypse, Judgment Day, call it whatever you want. We all had to leave because of this brutality. We had to leave because of ISIS. We had to leave because of Al-Qaeda. We had to leave because of the Russian airstrikes. We had to leave because of the Iranian militias. We had to leave because of the war's hypocrisy. Because the UN, the United Nations, has completely became a useless, expensive talk show. That's all I can call it. They spend billions of dollars to send aid to us, to people under siege. I lived for 2 years under siege. I didn't see a single piece of bread, not a piece of medicine for the starving children who kept dying just because we didn't have food or medicine to treat them. And then when I left and I went to the United States with the help of a brave Swedish diplomat and some really amazing women in Lebanon, Syrian ladies and other women who actually helped me run from Hezbollah in Lebanon and escape to the United States. When I went to the White House, Congress, the Pentagon, CIA, United States, the United Nations, the Security Council, Yale, Princeton, all the think tanks, Brookings, and I was just all over the place trying to get people to actually do something about it. But after spending more than 2 years running around politicians and whatever, those powerful people, the people who wear the masks that I tell you about, but I guess as long as you're wearing a fancy suit and expensive Rolex, you get to do whatever you want in this world.
And then you ended up in Germany.
I ended up in Germany because I left America out of the hypocrisy that I've seen and also out of fear that Trump is going to become president. I was running around DC in 2016 and telling everyone Trump's going to get president. Everyone was telling me, oh, you're new, you're stupid, whatever, go back. I was like, okay, we'll see about that. I left, I came to Germany, and only to be surprised, first, by the kindness of the German people and the great efforts by the German government to help hundreds of thousands of people. But in the same time, I ended up living in a place where Nazis are literally on the rise. In Sachsen-Anhalt, where the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, who are simply the new Nazis, who draw the swastikas on the walls and demonstrate every day screaming that we want to cleanse the refugees, we want to kill them all.
You showed me the video of the graffiti just outside your house, and in fact Sachsen-Anhalt is the state where the city of Halle is based, and you all have heard about the
Yes, it was
Yom
just
Kippur attack
yesterday. The Nazis again went after the Jews in a synagogue and they killed them. 2 weeks before, just 1 hour away from my house. 2 weeks before, they burned a mosque. They keep demonstrating almost every week. And when the cops show up, they don't show up to stop them. They show up to protect them. Most people, most refugees, most normal people, they actually don't trust the police anymore. We all heard about the officers who got caught in Berlin and other places in Germany who actually are preparing hit lists, who are very big, like officers in the Bundes police. People don't feel safe anymore. The same fascists that I ran away from in my country, I come back and I see them waiting for me in Germany. It's a pretty fucked up world.
So from us versus them, in a way, we're kind of moving into us versus us, because this problem, this liberal versus illiberal, however we want to call this standpoint, it actually has come to our own societies. It's happening in our societies. Sergey, I want to come to you. You know, the West has led these, seems to be unable to support these pro-democracy activists in various parts of the world. The West seems to be unable to create or to deliver on its promise of a multi-ethnic democracy where there is no us versus them, there is just an us. Viewed from Russia and from Moscow in 2019, is liberalism failing? Is Western democracy on its way out?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy.
Can you move a little closer?
I have a lot of sympathy for my neighbors, but I'm an old man. My advice to them, use a bit more of Chinese or Arabic accent. Your American is too clean. That's first. Second, democracy is one of the ways of governing societies. Democracy was born here, then it was gone, Rome, etc. Many. It was twice in my country, in Novgorod Republic, and in February 17, only to be followed by communist tyranny. Worst time in the history of my country. So it's not a panacea. It's one of the ways of governing. By the way, democracy in this form was saved when all democratic countries, but Britain, which was supported by the United States, and two undemocratic countries, Serbia and Greece, have surrendered to Hitler. And only due to Russian perseverance and luck and the tyrannic regime did European democracy was saved. Otherwise, it would have been a different political system. I think that democracy, the liberal democracy, in this way it has developed during the last 30 years, is not survivable. Very simple, because it runs against the basic instincts and the basic value of the mankind. I have had this ideology of communism, which was even more beautiful than liberal ideology. Equality to all, overcoming states, overcoming nationalities, being governed not by the world government, but even by something more beautiful, like proletarian international. I mean, it died ignominiously because it was inhuman. It did not correspond to the normal values of the man or of the woman, of the humanity. So liberal democracy in this sense, which it is here, of course it is doomed, but democracy will survive. And I must say that I do not agree that democracy is dying in the world. It is more democratic than ever for two reasons. One is that now countries, internationally, now countries have more freedom than ever in history to choose their ways, their cultural paths, their economic models than ever. The second is, of course, that even in more authoritarian countries, because of the information revolutions, people have a much more possibility to influence their governance, even in not formally democratic countries. And I am happy to say that these democracies, especially the first kind of democracy, was indeed brought by Russians, which were not interested in in fighting liberal democracy. It's your business. We're there, we're looking at you sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with regret. But we really contributed to the demise of what you call the liberal democracy by doing away with military superiority, on which Western dominance in culture, economics, politics have been based for 500 years. And now the West has to compete on equal terms, and others have the right and the possibility to use their competitive advantages, and they use them. And so we are happy that by defending ourselves, defending our freedom and sovereignty, and by our security, we have helped the humanity to do away with Western yoke.
So the us versus them, when you listen to President Putin sometimes, almost sounds like a clash of civilizations. He talks about Russia being the true guardian of European culture and of Christianity, and talks about the demise and the decadence of multiculturalism in Western Europe. Is the true us versus them not Russia versus the West? And aren't you actively trying to bring that about? It's not just the West bringing that upon itself. You are actively trying to disrupt our democracies.
Listen, when I hear that we are trying to, interfere, it's bizarre or kinky. Of course, I wish we had had more of a success there, because we had to teach our Western neighbors not to interfere and not to throw stones in living in crystal palaces. But when we learned, how much interference there was in the United States after the Mueller report, I said, oh, come on, I would have wanted more, because that would have put up my national pride. But we do not care. As to the question, we are culturally European, we are culturally old European, we adhere as a society. There are many other inner societies in my country to, I would say, what called traditional European values. But we are not exactly a European society. Culturally, yes, of course. And Aristotle, as well as Sandal, are our writers.
But you have
but politically and socially, we are largely, I think, heirs to the Genghis Khan Empire. Otherwise, it wouldn't have become a huge empire. Wouldn't have, and without conquering Siberia and part of Asia, it wouldn't have become a great empire. It would have become another Poland, which. So we are a mix of civilizations, a mix of cultures, and it's our strength.
But Sergey, you know, your government is supporting national populists across Europe, partly in official cooperation agreements, like with the Freedom Party in Austria, partly with money, as the case with the Front National in France. You know, you're standing with members of parliaments of the AfD. Salvini runs around with a Putin T-shirt.
And
you are
maybe
aligned.
Unit 29155 is a Russian unit that's assigned by President Putin himself to sabotage, surveillance, and assassinations in Europe. You can actually mention that. You can also mention all the schools and the hospitals that you have bombed in Syria. The same hospitals that we gave the coordinates to the United Nations more than 2 years ago, so the United Nations will give it to the Russians to make sure that the Russians won't bomb it by mistake. What happened? More than 200 medical facilities were bombed. The disinformation campaign that the Russians are using to attack democracies all over the world, to make people turn against each other, Republicans against Democrats, Deutsch against British. We have Brexit, we have the AfD, we have all this madness that Putin is doing. Putin is nothing but a clown. He's a clown dressed as a president. And he does not terrify us, neither him or Winnie the Pooh. the Chinese Winnie the Pooh. He banned Winnie the Pooh. These are not, like, they're just bullies. If they're afraid of a cartoon, if he's afraid from some gay parades in Moscow, if those dictators are, this is who they are, they're just bullies. And the West somehow lost their balls somewhere in the past 50 years while they were partying after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the defeat of Nazis, while Nazis and communists were working on their comeback, and they have succeeded. I hate to bring the bad news, but the party is over. The party is over. Democracies are under attack. And if you don't fight for democracy, you don't actually deserve it. And I'm not offended. I'm not offended when someone tells me, oh, my English is good or whatever. I've been called a CIA agent, a terrorist, whatever, sexual, anything, just because dictators and tyrants will use any nickname, anything that will try to make people who are fighting for democracy, they will try to make them look bad. The West and Russians are attacking a little girl, Greta, the brave child, this brave hero, who are just simply running around the world and telling people, will you please listen to the scientists? We need a teenager to come and remind us that we should listen to science. We need teenagers to march in Washington and just to say, can we stop the gun violence? And when they do that, they've also been called propagandists, they've been called crazy, they've been called paid agents. So it doesn't matter. Dictators and fascists will always try to fuck or kill anything that's beautiful and anything that stands in their way.
Sergey, I want to give you a chance to reply. And then I'm going to throw it open to the audience, and I hope we're going to have 10 minutes of questions. But
thank you. I think you're thanked by others. As to your question, first of all, I mean, so-called populists, rightists, and the leftists. I'm sorry. So-called populist writers or leftists are born by the inner contradictions within the Western societies. Because we have had inequality. We talked about that. We have had elites which were disregarding the interests of the masses. We had minority elites which were imposing their values on the majorities, even in Europe, not speaking about the overall overwhelming majorities all over the world. So, I mean, populists and Trump are natural, I would say, defensive mechanisms of an ailing body to toxins. And I must say that, and I hope that Mr. Trump and the populists will cure. If you try to fight, I mean, the medicine, then you are dead on arrival. But if you take into consideration what is the message, then probably Western societies will recuperate. And I must say that I'm not all too happy about Mr. Trump, because Trump is making America strong again. And the United States would have been would continue to be strategic rival if even when the American elite decides to have a more civilized relationship with the outside world, including Russia. But Mrs. Clinton would have ruined the United States, so there would be no strategic rival.
Sergey, you revealed to me in a phone call before this conference that your mother was Jewish and that you lost a lot of family in the Holocaust, dozens of people. I just want to try to understand, as a German myself, how somebody with that personal history can defend movements who actively encourage, ethnic hatred and the us versus them, that in the past, we know exactly where that leads.
I'm sorry. Of course, we know what ultranationalism or chauvinism means, and we have been fighting it. The Russians have been fighting. I have been fighting it in my own country, and we won. We could give our experience to our friends in Europe, and they could learn, but we are not imposing it. How to deal with these things. As to the question of immigration, which is one of the causes of this wave of discontent, let me remind us all that this wave of immigration was born not by liberal humanists here who are defending the rights of those of immigrants. It was born by cynical profiteers in the 60s and in the 70s who introduced mass migration first into the United States and then into Europe in order to suppress wages, that's a fact of life, and undermine trade unions. And and that has happened. Then, of course, it became an ideological movement. As to Russian experience, we are the country second in the world in terms of taking in immigration. And we know how to deal with it. I'm sorry. I think if Europeans want to have advice, I mean, let them go to the Russian experience, because we are a country of immigrants. We are a melting pot. And go to the United States, which have a much better way of dealing with the massive immigration. They're even more country of immigrants. I think maybe you will find some clues.
Nathan, before we throw it open, just very briefly back to you. Having listened to Sergey and Kassem, I mean, what sort of lessons do you draw for your democracy movement now? Are you looking at the West and thinking they got a lot of things right, but they're getting a lot of things wrong? Are they helping you enough now? What sort of democracy are you going for, observing how the world looks now?
I think for a lot of freedom fighters, we have a belief that democracy is of course is not perfect, but as if it unfolds, the thing that we are doing should be refining it, enhancing it, instead of abandoning it and embrace authoritarianism. It is going backward in history. And of course, we know that from the experience we deal with China, there are several things that we need to be aware for the Western leaders and Western world that, these things could happen in your hometown, in your home country. The money comes from China, from the authoritarian regimes, is definitely colored. They comes with condition, they comes with agenda of you, requesting you to counterweight it, to bend over to agendas. Like, for example, the things happening on NBA, a general manager of Rockets just issued a statement supporting the demand of democracy of Hong Kong, and the whole China is coming out to say that, we're going to ban NBA, and the netizens of the Chinese netizen going over to Twitter to tweet that, they support 911 because it is an act of revenge to the support of Hong Kong from the US side, and how absurd it is. And it shows that the agenda behind it is definitely pushing forward and kind of ingrained it into the liberal democracy that, they will come into your hometown and infiltrate you and try to install these authoritarian seats into your homeland. And it's the second lesson that we have to be aware of, is the infiltration from these authoritarian regimes. They're abusing the openness of our democracy, like Russia, like China. They're doing all these internet campaigns. They're sending academies, and they're working with the local student, local authority, the embassies, to monitor the people in their hometown and spreading these authoritarian values. And we have to develop defending mechanism to look over it, not because we are not inclusive, it's because we have to protect the others in our places. Like when I was having a talk in Yale, one Chinese student come over to me, and he said that, look, it is unsafe for me to talk with you, because he knows that there are always surveillance to the Chinese students in their own campus, which when someone spotted them, they're talking with me, they will be in danger. Their visa could be cancelled. Their families back in China could be intimidated. So the acts and the spread of authoritarianism to the liberal democracies is actually threatening people who are running out of their countries and seeking liberal values, and they're living in fear. Mm-hmm. Their freedom of speech, their freedom of thoughts in the US, in some other countries, maybe in Greece, are being threatened. So this is a serious issue that democracies, I think, we have to develop mechanism that prevents these authoritarian regimes to abuse our system. And the third and the last tip for the leaders, we have to support the struggles worldwide, like in Syria, like voicing out the concentration camp in Xinjiang, the democracy fight in Hong Kong, because as Speaker Pelosi, who I share a state with, held a conference with us because we're pushing forward a bill in the US to sanction the Hong Kong officials who are responsible to the encroachment of liberty in Hong Kong, said that if we do not voice out human rights issue in China just because of commercial interest, we are losing all the morality to speak up for the other issues worldwide. And I think it is exactly the point that even though we have ties with them, even though we have to do business with them, we have to remain identified that we stand our own ground and we do not bend over them just because of commercial interest. And we have to speak up for the struggles worldwide. Because, like in Hong Kong, we are standing in the forefront of the clash of authoritarian and liberal values. And if the communism prevails this time, it could symbolize another fallout of liberal democracy. And that's what we are afraid of. So I think these 3 tips is for all of you to think that whether your hometown, your liberal democracy is resisting the spread of authoritarian values. And I think all of us share a responsibility of it.
It's time for questions, and I'm being shown 2, come on, quickly. Oh, 1 question from a student, and 1 student question from the front, and 1 audience, the lady back there in white. Here we go. Keep it concise, otherwise I'll get into trouble.
Right. My name is Shreya Lad. I'm from the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. My question is for Mr. Karaganov. So you said that democracy, people have more democracy even in authoritarian countries because there's so much information that the state is actually listening to the people. How true is this, considering there is so much dissent being silenced and anything that's said against the government in so many countries is immediately silenced and shut down? The country where I come from, if you say something against the government, you get labeled as an anti-national. How true is it that because of information we are getting more democratic and the state is listening to us?
Thank you. I'm looking at this issue historically. 30 years ago it was much worse anywhere, everywhere. 50 years even worse than 30 years ago. Now, I know that even in relatively close societies are much more open than they used to be. They've never been as open. And I know that in some autocratic countries, the public opinion is watched and influenced like mad, more than in some democratic societies, as we have just noticed. But we are living in a fast-moving world, and I'm against, I would say, any ideological dominance, be that political correctness or any other of correctness. I'm very pleased that at my university, and I'm a dean, when Western professors come, they're absolutely amazed at the freedom of debate among the faculty and the students. In the West, they do not have that freedom of debate anymore because of liberal political correctness. People are ousted. In my school, I have ultra-liberals. Some people here know. I have very conservative people. The only thing which are banned is hatred talk. That's it.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment because there's a lot of, with all due respect, there's a lot of misinformation. The world is not getting better. It's actually getting worse, and it's getting more dangerous for a lot of people. You know, there's less than 5% of the world that lives actually under real democracy. What about the rest of the 95% of the population? What about the rest of us the blurry faces, the people who serve you food and fight your war and give you pleasure and do all this shit for you, while you get to sit and enjoy the benefits of freedom and democracy, and you get to have these fancy, expensive talk shows about how the world is progressing, while in fact we're getting back to the Stone Ages. We're back to jungle law. There's no international law. War criminals get to walk around the world and do whatever they want. They get to get their billions of dollars and invest them in Paris and London and Switzerland, and they get to live freely, like Rifat al-Assad, Bashar's uncle, the man who slaughtered more than 50,000 people in 1982 in Hama, and he gets to spend his billions in Paris and London. We mentioned over the phone that all this talk about refugees and getting them back and how to help them. Refugees don't want any penny or any dollar from your tax-paying money. We just want our money back. The billions of dollars, the trillions of dollars that the tyrants stole from our land and invest them in your banks. If we get back our money, we can rebuild our countries, and perhaps some of those economies will actually collapse, like London and Switzerland. If the war criminals around the world, not just from the Middle East, if they will take their trillions of dollars out of London and other places, we won't need a single dime. We will rebuild our countries. We will make our countries a better place for everyone. And then all of you guys, you are very welcome to come and visit us and be our honorable guests. And we will always remember the kindness that you have showed us.
So I'm going to invite the lady back there to meet us in the speaker's room, special privilege, because I'm being cut short here like this. Basically, I think this was fascinating. This was basically the young pro-democracy activist generation telling us, the West, why we're still inspiring, and that we have to hold on to what we have, and that we shouldn't be selling out our values, and that we should be standing up for those who actually defend our values for us in the streets. And then we have those who aim to disrupt us, and they sometimes know our weaknesses better than we know them ourselves. If you study the Russian disinformation campaigns, they hit us where it hurts, and that's because they know us well. So I think it's worth studying how other people look at us in a way to understand what's wrong with the moment that we're in right now. Thank you very much, and I wish we had more time.